Hey everybody, welcome back to Off the Grid Tiny House. We're on day 17 of our 50-day challenge. If you want to learn more about that, check out our intro video. In our last episode, we installed the roof shingles, and in this episode, we're going to complete the framing details of the tiny house. This includes a bump out on either end, 2 additional interior walls, and a small storage loft. The bump outs add quite a bit of complexity to the construction of the tiny house, but I think they'll be well worth it. They'll allow for some much needed storage space without adding trailer length, and they will also contribute to the curb appeal. Each of the bump outs is like its own miniature house. So just like we started the main tiny house with our subfloor framing, we start the bump outs with subfloor framing. Move on to subfloor, wall framing, ceiling framing, wall sheathing, roof framing, roof sheathing, insulation, and roofing. So our episode today is kind of like a mini repeat of everything we've done so far in the build. The additional interior walls will really make the floor plan of the tiny house come to life as we assemble the wall that separates the bedroom from the bathroom and another tiny wall that separates the toilet and shower compartments. The spacing on these walls is very important because the shower enclosure, sink vanity, and washing machine have fixed dimensions, and we need to make sure they'll fit between the walls. The loft area here will act as a storage space and also house the ERV, or energy recovery ventilator. An ERV operates 24/7 to remove old, stale, damp air from the tiny house and replace it with clean, fresh, filtered air from the outdoors. We'll discuss ERVs in more detail in a future episode. Let's take a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish today. We'll be framing a bump out on either end of the tiny house, starting with the subfloor framing and ending with the roof shingles. This is a great opportunity to review everything you've learned so far, as we will repeat what we did in almost every episode as we build the bump outs. We will frame and raise 2 additional interior walls and attach them to what is called ladder blocking in the exterior walls. Last, we will frame ceiling joists to sit on top of the interior walls and form the small loft area. The first step in framing the bump outs was to cut out the sheathing. I drilled a small hole in each corner from the inside and then snapped a chalk line on the outside between each of the holes so I would know where to cut. I then fine-tuned this cut to make sure that the sheathing was cut back precisely to the framing. This will help ensure that the bump out fits into the opening. Next, I framed the subfloor of the bump out using 2x6 rim joists and floor joists, just as we did way back in episode 3. I cut a piece of subfloor to fit over the top of the framing and nailed it in place just like we did in episode 6. I hoisted the subfloor up into position and banged one end into place in the wall opening. I supported the other side temporarily while I cut the supports. The support pieces are cut at 45-degree angles and carry the load from the opposite end of the bump out back to the main wall framing. Each support piece lines up with a joist on the bump out and a stud in the main wall. This ensures the load of the bump out is balanced properly. I used toenails to nail the support pieces of the framing. This allowed me to fine-tune each of the supports until the bump out was level on both ends. So you guys saw I've done the whole house design on CAD. However, real wood is not a computer. And especially when you're trying to fit wood into a space, you'll notice that the measurements are going to kind of shrink a little bit. So we're going to be framing up some walls right here, and we need them to fit inside this opening. And if I just use the measurements I had on CAD, it would be way too big. So what we're going to do is just kind of mock up what we're going to have here. So we're going to have a top and a bottom plate. So obviously one of those will be up top, but we're just going to keep them down here for now. And then we're going to have our ceiling joists. And ceiling joists will run across. Again, that's going to be up top, but we're just going to keep it down here for now. So when I'm sizing up the studs for this wall, I want to make sure that it's going to fit. So I had to shorten this. On CAD, this was actually, it's going to be tight. It'll fit though. Snug is good. On CAD, this was 53.5 inches. Well, after all of this, just little bits of adjustments, the wood's just a little bit bigger. There's a tiny gap with the nail. We have this floor joist, the subfloor, the plates, this ceiling joist. this got knocked down a full 1/4 inch, so it's 53 1/4 instead of 53 1/2. So you want to make sure that it's going to fit before you cut them. I next framed up 2 short walls and 1 long wall for each bump out using 2x4s and nailed them into place just like in episode 7. Again, it's important for these bump out wall studs to line up with the subfloor joists to ensure a good load transfer from the roof of the bump out down to the subfloor framing. So you might be wondering why the layout is kind of off. You know, these look really close together and then these are really far apart. Oh, it's because I want to keep that 2 foot on center going. I'm trying to just keep that throughout the house. Everything lines up really nice. So we got 2 foot on center here, and then we got 2 foot on center to the outside, all the way out here. Because remember, here's our 2 foot stud right here. So if you measure all the way from the outside, it is equal distance. Hey guys, I spend my time and money making these videos for you because I want to give you the confidence and knowledge for you to build your own tiny house. In return, I'd really appreciate it if you could pause this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and visit our Patreon page. Your support ensures that you'll see more awesome videos like this one. If you do start building your own tiny house, you can use the links in the description below to purchase your tools and supplies, and that also helps out the channel. The main tiny house didn't have any ceiling framing because I designed it to have a cathedral ceiling. The bump outs, however, will have a traditional ceiling. This means that our next step is to frame the ceiling of the bump outs. The ceiling framing is identical to the subfloor framing, except we'll use 2x4s instead of 2x6s because there is less weight for the ceiling framing to carry. I banged the ceiling framing into the opening between the bump out walls and the top of the main wall opening and nailed it into place with 16D nails. On top of the ceiling framing, I nailed a set of 2x4 rafters with bird's mouths cut, just as we did back in episode 9. So I don't talk a lot about specific measurements because hopefully you're going to design your own tiny house and you're not just following what I have, which is custom made for what I'm looking for. But I did want to talk just a little bit about sizing your rafters. So the slope is whatever you want. You know, I chose a 312 slope for this little bump out roof here. And so I cut this with a 312, and we already learned how to do that using our speed square. But as far as sizing out the bird's mouth, you know, you want to just line that 312 up right where it feels strong, and then you come over here and you can see where I've marked where the wall is right there, and that's we're gonna run a line up there parallel with our 312 cut there, and then we want to go up so far as to get a nice 3.5 inches or so right here. You know, 3 inches at least. You want a decent amount of bearing here. So you can move this. It's called a plumb cut because when you cut it, it's going to be plumb. So you can move this plumb cut deeper and deeper until you feel comfortable. You don't want to go too deep because then the wood is not going to have any strength left. But if you go too shallow, then there's not a whole lot of strength attached to your ceiling joist frame here. I nailed a 2x6 subfascia to the end of the rafters. So what we're going to be doing is building up our blocking in between the rafters so that this is flush right here, because air sealing, this needs to be covered. This is way too big of a gap to be covered with foam. So if you can imagine, we're going to have our roof sheathing right here, but this is not part of the conditioned space of the tiny house. This is the end of the wall. This is just the overhang. So what we need to do is build up this area. So what I'm going to do is I have a block here, and I'm just going to make a mark there. And so if we cut a piece to fit like that, it should fill that space in perfectly. So we'll go on the table saw and we'll cut some bevel cuts and see how we do. So you can see the line that I made, and we're just going to make a bevel cut and cut to that line. That way our blocking is lined up perfect with the top of our rafters. So we can see here on this one, we're perfect right here. We're a little bit low right here, but that's okay. Now we're at a low enough gap where we can finish it off with some spray foam. So we'll nail these in, and then we'll put our roof sheathing on. Next, I cut a piece of OSB roof sheathing to fit over the top of the rafters and subfascia, and glued on a layer of Polyiso foam and then screwed on one more layer of OSB sheathing, just as we did in episode 10. The last step was to attach the roof drip edge, underlayment, and shingles, just as we did in the last episode. With the bump outs complete, it was time to frame the 2 remaining interior walls. I won't go into too much detail on these because we've already had plenty of instruction on framing walls. On top of the interior walls, I nailed 2 rim joists into place. And between the 2 rim joists, I nailed ceiling joists. This is the ceiling framing for the bathroom area. Putting a normal height ceiling in the bathroom compared to the raised cathedral ceiling for the rest of the tiny house creates a nice little storage loft over the bathroom. Every episode I want to take some time to talk about the mistakes I made, and this episode I had to move a couple of studs that I had originally designed to be about 6 inches away from where I moved them. So, I designed the whole house in CAD because it allows you to really visualize how things will fit together, and things like drywall, siding, sheathing. You can see where it's going to get nailed, and you can make sure that there's an attachment point for everything and that there's room for your plumbing, etc. One thing I missed when I was doing that is nailing for the bump out plywood sheathing. And I had originally planned for this stud to be in the middle here, and I ended up having to move it about 3 or 4 inches over towards the main part of the tiny house so that the bump out sheathing would have a place to nail to. It was a quick fix. I just had to take those studs out, and I used a Sawzall to remove the nails and just move it over and re-nail it. So not a huge deal, but definitely a good idea to make sure you have things thoroughly planned out. In our next episode, we'll be installing base flashing and a WRB, or weather-resistant barrier, to the walls of the tiny house. WRB is a very important layer because it is the primary rainwater control layer for the tiny house. Hope you can all join me on our next episode as I install base flashing and a WRB.